The wind had been rising since late afternoon. Out on the open prairie, winter storms could appear almost without warning. The sky would dim, the air would sharpen, and before long the world turned white and restless. That evening, Daniel Harper was guiding his horse slowly along the narrow trail that led back to his small ranch. Daniel was a quiet man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered from years of honest work. His dark beard had begun to show threads of gray, though he rarely noticed. Life had given him more responsibilities than time to think about age. He had spent the day repairing a broken fence line near the northern ridge. It had been one of those long days where the cold crept into your bones no matter how hard you worked. As the wind began to howl across the plains, Daniel pulled his coat tighter. "Storm's coming fast," he murmured to the horse. The prairie around him had already begun to disappear behind swirling curtains of snow. In moments like this, the land felt endless and lonely. But Daniel had lived here long enough to know something else. Out here, you never ignored a storm. He urged the horse forward, hoping to reach home before the worst of it arrived. Then something unusual caught his eye. At first it looked like nothing more than a shadow against the snow. Daniel slowed. The shape moved. He narrowed his eyes through the blowing wind. It was a person. A woman. She was stumbling through the snow, barely able to keep her balance. Her dark dress whipped violently in the wind, and she looked as if she might collapse at any moment. Daniel didn't hesitate. He swung down from his horse and hurried toward her. "Ma'am," he called through the storm. "Over here." The woman turned weakly toward the sound. Her face was pale, her dark hair tangled by the wind. Snow clung to her shoulders and sleeves. For a moment she tried to speak, but her voice was lost in the gale. Daniel reached her just as her knees gave out. He caught her before she hit the ground. Her hands were freezing cold. "Easy now," he said gently. "You're safe." She looked up at him with tired, frightened eyes. I couldn't find the road." Daniel wrapped his coat tighter around her shoulders. "Well," he said softly, "you found me instead. That's good enough for tonight." He helped her onto the horse and guided them both slowly toward the ranch. The ride back took nearly an hour. By the time they reached the small wooden cabin, the storm had grown fierce. Snow slammed against the windows, and the wind rattled the walls like a restless visitor. Inside, the cabin glowed with warm lantern light and the steady crackle of the iron stove. Daniel helped the woman sit on the edge of the bed. Up close, she looked to be in her early 30s. There was something refined about her posture, something calm and composed even in exhaustion. But right now she was shivering too hard to speak. Daniel poured a cup of warm tea and placed it carefully in her hands. "Drink slow," he said. She nodded gratefully. The warmth began to return to her face little by little. After a few minutes she managed a faint smile. "My name is Margaret Lawson," she said quietly. Daniel tipped his hat slightly. "Daniel Harper." For a while neither of them spoke. The storm outside roared and rattled, but inside the cabin everything felt calm. Margaret looked around the room. The place was simple but welcoming. A small wooden table. A neatly folded quilt. A pair of worn boots by the door. The kind of home built by steady hands and patient years. "You live here alone?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Been that way for a while." His voice carried no bitterness. Just quiet acceptance. Margaret studied his face for a moment. "You came looking for me in that storm," she said softly. Daniel shrugged slightly. "Anyone would've." She gave a gentle shake of her head. "No, not everyone." Daniel didn't respond to that. Instead he placed another log in the stove. The fire brightened, casting warm light across the wooden walls. Margaret watched the flames for a moment. "My carriage lost a wheel miles back," she explained. "My driver went to find help, but the snow started falling so fast. I thought I could walk to the next ranch." Daniel chuckled quietly. "Next ranch is 15 miles south." Her eyes widened slightly. "Well," she said with a tired laugh, "that explains why I wasn't getting anywhere." For the first time that evening, Daniel smiled. It was the kind of smile that appeared slowly but carried warmth. They sat together for a while longer. Outside, the storm continued its restless dance across the prairie. Inside, the small cabin felt peaceful. After some time Margaret spoke again. "You didn't ask who I was," she said. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Well, you're someone who needed help. That's all?" "That's enough." Margaret looked thoughtful. In her life, people usually asked many questions. About her name. Her family. Her land. Her wealth. But Daniel hadn't asked a single one. He had simply helped. The next morning arrived quietly. The storm had passed. Sunlight spread across the snow-covered prairie like a fresh beginning. Daniel stepped outside and looked across the land. The world was still. Then he heard the distant sound of horses. Several riders were approaching quickly from the eastern ridge. Daniel frowned slightly. That many riders usually meant something important. The group reached the cabin within minutes. At the front rode a tall older man dressed in a heavy ranch coat. The moment he saw Margaret step onto the porch, relief flooded his face. "Miss Lawson." He dismounted quickly. Margaret greeted him calmly. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker." The man turned to Daniel with visible gratitude. "You must be the rancher who helped her." Daniel nodded politely. Whitaker extended his hand. "Sir, you've done a great kindness." Daniel shook his hand. "Just gave her a warm place for the night." Whitaker looked slightly amazed. "You realize who she is, don't you?" Daniel glanced toward Margaret. She watched quietly. "No," Daniel said honestly. Whitaker smiled. "This is Margaret Lawson, owner of the Lawson Territory Ranch." Daniel raised his eyebrows slightly. Even people far beyond these plains knew that name. The Lawson Ranch stretched across thousands of acres. It was the largest ranch in the territory. Margaret stepped forward, her expression calm and kind. "I didn't mention it last night," she said gently. "It didn't seem important." Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he chuckled softly. "Well, I reckon Cole doesn't care much about ranch sizes." Margaret laughed warmly. It was the kind of laugh that felt rare and genuine. She looked out across the prairie. "My father used to say something," she said quietly. "He believed a person's true character showed when no one important was watching." She turned toward Daniel. "Last night, you didn't know who I was." Daniel shrugged. "You were someone out in a blizzard." Margaret nodded slowly. "And that tells me more about a man than any introduction ever could." The riders began preparing to leave. Before mounting her horse, Margaret turned back to Daniel. "Mr. Harper. I'd like you to visit the Lawson Ranch sometime." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "What for?" Margaret smiled gently. "Well, every large ranch needs people who understand what kindness looks like." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully. "I'll think on it." Margaret nodded. Then she rode away with the group, disappearing across the bright white plains. Daniel stood quietly for a moment. Then he stepped back into his cabin. The fire still glowed warmly in the stove. He poured himself another cup of tea and looked out the window at the quiet land. Life on the prairie had taught him many things over the years. Storms came and went. Fortunes rose and fell. But one truth remained steady. Kindness given freely had a way of traveling farther than a man ever expected. And sometimes, all it took to change a life was stopping in the middle of a storm.